Hi, I made this video because I think a lot of people who even try to think about, did lockdown work? Was it worth it? To try and come to some kind of peace with a very difficult set of circumstances around the cost of lockdown, as obviously the cost of COVID, are shouted down because, they're just told that lockdown is common sense, right? And this is such a prevailing belief that people feel quite entitled to tell people that it's common sense and that that it's ridiculous to question it. Now, I have other videos that I look at this through different lenses, both historic, the fact that this was something new to science, as the WHO pointed out on the 23rd of January when China went into lockdown, as well as the direct evidence, the statistical evidence around what's actually gone on, to look at that being quite mixed. But what I want to do in this video is simply look at the common sense argument. And really, the common sense argument splits into two parts. The first typical argument is to say, look, we stopped a disaster, it's common sense. Clearly, the epidemic was growing exponentially. We went into lockdown and now it's going away. And there's a lot of truth to that pattern, overall, in a very low resolution way of looking at things. Yes, the epidemic grew, there were lockdowns, and now it's going away. And we could look at that statistically to see if that's correct, but I'm going to keep with a kind of common sense notion. So that's that's a strong argument. It's a possible thing. And the other is social distancing is obvious. The virus is passed through respiratory droplets, which travel only 1 to 2 meters because gravity pulls them to the floor. By social distancing, we stopped the virus from spreading. How can it spread if we're not bumping into each other? How can it spread if we're social distancing? Therefore, it is common sense that lockdown works. And there's nothing wrong with these arguments. They're good, strong arguments to make, and I'm not going to criticize them being made, except to point out that they are quite low resolution arguments. They are quite broad brush and they miss things. And what I wanted to do was to just show how such kind of broad arguments miss some of the subtleties that you really need to think about when you talk about lockdown. And then you might get a more mixed picture about whether a lockdown working is actually common sense or not. There's clearly reasons to think that it might work, but it's not obvious actually if you take the whole picture in that it's common sense that it will work. So here's the first problem. You've got to keep the lights on. You've got to keep people fed. You've got to keep the water, the electricity. You've got the doctors and nurses, the emergency services, right? And all of the transportation that supports that, all of the utilities that support all of those things. Now, the result of doing that, the result of being able to keep some semblance of a comfortable lifestyle in the UK was the requirement for 10 million key workers to keep doing their job. That's roughly 33% of the workforce. And that's what was needed to keep the lights on. And of course, these people were not able to be locked down. They did not stay in their homes. They did not go out once a day. They went to work in communal spaces, often in close proximity to people, because that's what they had to do for their work, because they were key workers. Now, key workers are not some mystical group off in the corner by themselves. They're spread throughout the population. 91% of key worker families only had one key worker in them, which means that 30 to 40% of households were interconnected by key workers, which means in turn that 30 to 40% of the population was connected together by key workers, meaning that they weren't really locked down. They were outside of lockdown. Even if those people were staying indoors, they were still in close proximity a lot of the time to somebody who was going about their business and working in communal spaces and in close proximity to infection. And so we have to bear that in mind. That is a huge number of people. You're talking about around 25 million people were not part of lockdown in that, looked at it from that perspective. And we know that within that population, particularly the healthcare workers, and there are 1.5 million workers in the NHS, and if you go to ICU, you go to a COVID-based unit, you will find that infection was rife. Serology tests have shown sometimes results as high as 30% in these units. That's well above the kind of typical 5% you might find in the population. So clearly there was a lot of COVID that went around in this audience, so it spread everywhere. And that's, maybe you could say, oh, that demonstrates that we suppressed the virus. Maybe it does, but of course we're saying that 25 million people were not part of lockdown. So whatever effect it had to be limited because the key workers could not fully participate in that process. That was compounded by another problem. COVID is a contagious respiratory disease. That is incredibly difficult to contain that. If we had 5 cases in the UK of measles or Ebola, and we wanted to contain it, then what would happen is these individuals would be moved into negative pressure rooms. People treating them would be in full hazmat suits. There would be hepatic filters on the output, the ventilated outputs of these rooms. We would probably have UV lights in there to kill off any viruses, etc., that were airborne. Even though Ebola is more fluid-based contact, but we would still have all that protocol in place. Now, it's laughable to suggest that fabric masks, goggles, or perspex shields over your face, maybe if you're in the NHS, you've got a gown, you've got gloves, if you're social care, you might have that is a replacement for a full hazmat protocol. It absolutely isn't. We only had access to light PPE. Now, why is that? Why didn't we all just wear hazmat suits? Well, firstly, it would have been impossible to suit up that many people and keep all those suits clean and do all of that. Actually, there isn't the resource to do that from a manpower perspective. But if we just ignore that, there was a global supply chain problem. The amount of hazmat grade PPE that any country has is very, very limited. It's for extreme circumstances, treating maybe, let's say, 10 patients in the UK or something. And now we're trying to treat, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 patients. And we've got to assume that because there's asymptomatic infections and mildly symptomatic infection, and it could be broad within the population, we have to assume that everybody is infected. And this is just impossible. You can't use this level of PPE. It's not practical. It wasn't done. And so there's a dramatic over-expectation that PPE would stop the infection from spreading. And we know that the evidence for this level of PPE preventing the spread of COVID is weak and mixed at best, which is why we had a debate about whether people were going to wear masks on public transport, because it is so mixed. So you can't sort of go, yeah, PPE protected the key worker population, stopped it from spreading. No, of course it didn't. And I could go on about the problems of the time it takes to put it on and the rationing and how that would have prevented in a lot of spaces people from being adequately doffed out and donned out in PPE. That would not have happened. Another interesting thing to think about is the vulnerable people that are likely to die are the ones being looked after the key workers, which are subject to the infection. The deaths from COVID, 90% are over the age of 65, 60% over 80, with serious other diseases being a factor in 90% of cases. These are not well people. These are not people on average that can look after themselves completely. They're people that need a certain degree of care. And that care during the lockdown rules usually had to come from key workers. And those key workers were themselves suffering from outbreaks and infections. They had PPE, but that wasn't adequate to protect the vulnerable people. And so inevitably what happened, we can argue about, did it come in through old people being moved from hospital to care homes, or just simply that there was such a rife level of infection inside of the key worker community that it got into the care homes, it got into it affected the elderly, and we saw the same number of deaths. And even if you made the case that we suppressed the population to only being inside of the key workers, and I think that would definitely not match with the data. But if we said that, then what the result of that would be is to say that we had nearly the same number of deaths. And it didn't save that many lives, and the reason it wouldn't save that many lives is because all those vulnerable people were being cared for by key workers, and so the virus would get to them. So that's another reason why you could pull apart the common sense idea of lockdown. And perhaps the fourth thing is, with too much of the time when we deal with these kind of measures, we think in these kind of theoretical models and these sort of rules of thumb that are embedded into them, which just aren't true. So, for instance, hygiene, hand hygiene, very much proven from surgery. If I go into an operating theatre, I wash my hands, I put on gloves, I go into a sterile environment, no question, this is proven to reduce infection, a real life-saving measure. But this is not really like real life. In real life, we're not going into a highly sterilized environment. In fact, we spend our day in a non-sterilized one. Most people wash their hands less than 3 times a day. If we could encourage them, increase that to 10 times a day, that's probably a realistic average that we could expect out of a population, even if they were being cooperative. That's washing your hands every 1.5 hours. Now, we touch about 100 things an hour, 100 surfaces from which we could pick up the virus. And we touch our face unconsciously about 16 times an hour. So you can spread it by touching your face and touching the surface, and then somebody touching the surface and touching the face. And between our hand washes, we touch 150 objects, and I'll touch our face about 24 times. And that's if we wash our hands 10 times a day, which I can promise you is not what's going on in the population. So when we think about that, how much does hand washing in a practical context decrease the spread of the virus? And of course it does to an extent. But this thought that it completely stops it is very unrealistic when you think about the actual circumstances. And too much of the time, the models, people are using mathematical models because there's almost no way to observe practically whether this is true. So they use theoretical models, but they assume that just wholesale there's less bugs on people's hands. And that's not actually a realistic way of looking at it. I hope this video has been a little helpful in sort of pulling apart that kind of common sense argument and sort of saying, do you know what? Yes, there are some common sense arguments for, and there are some common sense arguments against. So it's worth bearing in mind that common sense can go both ways on this.